Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon to everyone who's here today with us and who's listening to us in streaming. This is the first event designing enlightED, and thanks to the Foundation, Telefónica Foundation and our other company, we are beginning the 4th edition, which will take place in October. So enlightED has become an event which is really a benchmark, starting every month, every year in October, and it stretches over the months of summer. We've got a meeting on the 1st and 8th of July with different experts, because education's always been important and training has always been the basis of progress in society for humanity. We're conscious of the fact that we have to work even more and debate together so that we can really register everything we've learned and make sure that the future of humanity will be much better. Everything that we've experienced during the pandemic and the countries that continue to suffer from it and are still closed down, and the education centres that have had to close down, well, what we've seen there is how creativity came to the fore in many centres and institutions and administrations to be able to find other ways to take education out to pupils and students and to the whole of society. And we see how this gap, these economic gaps and social gaps, have also increased, and the education gap has increased over this time. So we have to go back to a very inclusive, the most inclusive system, which will enable us to reach those points, those locations that we haven't been able to reach with our education experts, so that centres have the right materials and resources to be able to reach that objective of education reaching everyone. So during this design processes of enlightED, we'll be looking at preparation in school, the university, occupational, professional education, what the market is demanding at this moment, and entrepreneurship around education, which will inspire all of us, I think, and will give us formulas which will be interesting and very useful for the education system. So without any more ado, we will open our first panel of debate, where we'll be working in the school area and looking at the direction taking, the trends that we see in education. We'll have the opportunity to see what the concerns are and what we'll be dealing with in the future in October, and what's really worrying the education community and what is most important for all of us. So I'll leave you with Pablo Gonzalo, who's the head of the cultural area, and very thankful for you being here.
Well, thank you very much, Carmen, and thank you all. One of the participants, Geordie, is missing, but he's just gone out to adjust his microphone. I'm going to take my face mask off because there's enough distance between us. So we're going to begin now, as Carmen said, with this first meeting, whose aim really is fundamentally, I believe, to build a community, because when we're talking about education, we were mentioning this before in the lunch we had, it is very important to build together. And we did not want to do this big October event that is repeated every year without making an effort in order to build little by little these big questions and subjects that which we want to put forward in October with all the educational community. And this panel and the two following ones, which will be on higher education and also about the environment of startups and education throughout life and in enterprise. Here we have Geordie, who was missing. He's just come. And I'm now going to introduce the people who are with us. Thank you to technology. First of all, we have, I don't know if this is connected. I hope it is connected. We have Alejandra Cardine. Hello, Alejandra.
Hi. It's lovely to see you all. I'm delighted to see that the technology will allow us to talk together, and I'm very sorry that I won't be able to be with you there.
Well, I hope that you'll be able to be here in October. Alejandra, thank you very much for participating. She's the director of the education program of the Implementation Center for Public Policies for Fairness and Growth in Argentina, public policies promoting equity and growth. And among other things, she's also a teacher of educational policy in the Austral University. And she has a lot of experience in education, and also she has a very profound and complete view of Latin America, and we'll be delighted for you to share this with us today, because enlightED is like a global event that we're doing, and we're very interested in that view. Thank you very much, Alejandra. And also we have, beginning on our right, we have Marisa. Hello, Marisa Calatayud. And she's a psychologist, and she's an expert in digital teaching, pedagogy. That is very important. It's becoming more and more important, I believe. And she's the director also, among many other things. I'm going to abbreviate the curriculums a little bit so that we can get straight into the debate as soon as possible, of active methodology courses and learning in the education of the Complutense University of Madrid. She also has a great deal of experience, and we are delighted to have her here.
Thanks, great to be here.
We also have Álvaro. Hello, Álvaro. Thank you for being here with us. Álvaro Ferrer Blanco, who is a specialist in educational equity, or fairness. She works with Save the Children, with a global vision. He's author or co-author of some reports that I've read in preparation on educational policies and equal opportunities. And apart from many other things, he's been a member of the Permanent Commission of the State Education Board. Thank you very much for accompanying us. Thank you very much for the invitation. And we'll finish with Geordie Mussons. Hello, how are you, Geordie? I'm fine, thank you. Thank you very much for being here with us. Geordie is the director and has been director for the last 15 years. He's been the director of the Sadako School, which is one of the schools that I think is distinguished in Spain because of its innovation, and it's a bit ahead of its times. I think you've been, I don't know if it's 15 years, but you've been innovating for a very long time, part of the ChangeMake network of Asoka. And also, he's published, among many other things, he's published also lately a book which is Reinventing School, and that he's just presented and published, and we have the good fortune of you having done it here, and I recommend that book to everybody. Thank you very much also for being here with us. So we'll begin the conversation now. Without further ado, with that idea of analysing, particularly, well, I would like to divide this into three different parts, more or less, although the conversation couldn't flow afterwards. And this is to see what we've been able to learn, firstly, and what conclusions, well, I don't know if there are conclusions, but at least impressions you've gleaned from how education has gone through the pandemic, and the different visions, I think, will be very interesting from Latin America and from Europe. Also to talk about the digital world, which for us in Telefonica is very relevant, I think, in the field of education, and and more areas it's becoming more and more important. Also to think a little bit about whether these changes that we're going through are also making us change what we should be teach and learning, not only how we teach and learn, but also what, because the uncertainty that we're all going through makes us have to change in that sense also. And since we have Alejandra, I would like to begin with her. I'd like to begin with you, Alejandra. Please, could you tell us a little bit from your point of view? It's a very broad subject, obviously, and a lot of things have happened, but how have you experienced, or that region, your region, how has it experienced the impact of the pandemic? What educational policies have been put in place? What's the experience? How have they worked? Please, just to start us off, give us an early view on that.
Okay, certainly. Thank you very much, Pablo, for the question. Well, I would start by talking about the region, Latin America. It's the most unequal region in the world and most affected by pandemic and the separation of classes. So it became the epicenter of the pandemic for the large part of last year, and we have 6 of the 25 countries in the world that had the worst, the highest number of deaths per 100,000. So we have 8% of the population of the world, but 25% of the deaths as a result of COVID-19. So this is reflected in the situation of education in Latin America. We were also most affected, the worst affected in the area of education. If we look at the separation of classes and the how this affected classes and education, we had we lost about 150 days of school. It affected us tremendously, and in Western Europe lost only 50 days. So the children in Latin America and the young people lost 3 times as much education as in Western Europe. So in this general context, the response given was an emergency response, responses without being able to plan, of course, faced with this huge need. But we took 4 approaches to be able to respond rapidly. First of all, very important in the whole region was access to content on internet, along with other strategies, strengthening connectivity and access to this equipment, also skill building and adaptation, modification in schools themselves so the teachers could communicate with the pupils. So the most effective measures were, schools were the ones that could most quickly adapt to the new situation using technology with remote teaching in some areas. Once they had the connectivity and platforms, this was effective. But there are other areas where we had to go back to the technologies of the 20th century, television and radio. So it wasn't so much a question of technology, but the link and between teachers and pupils using any type of technology to be able to contact each other, getting over this distancing. So this was one of the first approaches that we took. It's a very complex panorama that we have now today as a result of this.
I don't know if on this side of the panel, I would like you to add something to that along those lines, whoever would like to. And also to see that in spite that these are very different contexts, perhaps there are matters that can overlap or coincide. Would you like to talk, Geordie? Well, I think we're starting with very similar premises, but we have the privilege of being able to say that our education centres have been able to give the most number of class hours internationally, and that's a luxury that I think we have to applaud. But on the other hand, many of the other things that you've explained are very similar to what we experienced here in March last year. We had a very critical moment in which nobody had experienced before. We were all in our houses, and the only way to save ourselves, to connect with the world and with our reality, was technology. And the same happened from an educational point of view. The only nexus between teachers among themselves and students and pupils and among students and their families also was technology. And at the same time, I think that at that moment in time, simultaneously, all the gaps arose that you were mentioning, the digital, social, housing, gender, and also educational gaps. And from an educational point of view, I would insist on 2 clear ideas. One, the difficulty of access to technological tools. And logically enough, the most vulnerable part of our society is the part of the society that has most difficulties to access a device or the network, or the web, because sometimes they often provided, but they couldn't have access to the web, or not having a family who had to complement that. And on the other hand, I think that we're experiencing a great asymmetry in the educational proposal offered by different centres, and I would divide it into 3 different levels. On the one hand, the organizational asymmetry. Not all the centres were able to give a response at the same speed, with the same organizational capacity, flexibility. If you remember, at that moment in time, the majority of the population, well, we didn't know what Zone was, we didn't know what Meet was, or any of that. In just a week or fortnight, there were centres that were working with that structure, and other schools or centres that took a long time for all the organisation to connect up in this way. And there was a very significant asymmetry also of digital knowledge among teachers. The centres where the teachers had less capacities and digital abilities had a lot of difficulties in order to begin to get it going. And at the same level, the structures that were already working or not in each one of our centres of communication with the families in a structured way to begin at that moment in time to get that running for many education centres was very difficult. I'm insisting on that because I think that with these situations we have to learn in order to make the most of it in the future, to improve the education quality and fairness. And finally, although many centres had the capacity of having the devices, and they had the capacity to organise and structure a dynamic of accompanying a strong dynamic of education, not all the centres had educational projects of the same level. But what do I mean by this? Well, that the first image that I have of television, this was used a lot in South America, it was Spanish television. In the first class, what they did was that a teacher was giving a class broadcast about additions and subtractions of 4 figures in maths, so that the listeners were listening to a class with that methodology. And that's very different. I have to admit that Spanish television reacted very well, and subsequently did much better quality, but it is very transmissive very poor. This has nothing to do with the pedagogical structures, where it is more well established, where there's cooperation, learning processes, interrelations with teachers. And this asymmetry in the education proposition has also created gaps in the learning of the students depending on the educational centre. This is something that has to make us think about how we can make the models more uniform, and the use of the technologies in order for them to have a high quality, and also to promote fairness and equity, which is the debate, isn't it? Thank you. Well, well, Alvaro, what do you think about this? Well, I think that Geordie has hit the nail on the head by talking about equity and fairness. We talk a lot about the digital gap, but what we've seen really is a social gap. In the end, we're talking about devices, we're talking about resources in the family. We were talking about, for example, about the refectory, because of the situation of the many family where that food is fundamental. And you can see how the disappearance of face-to-face schooling generates us having to think about the inequalities in our society, which have become much more evident when that school disappears and we go back home. But I think also that Geordie has hit the nail on the head in another gap that I think is fundamental. That's the pedagogic gap, which also has a social dimension, because it has been the centres, and we know this because of the data from PISA, it's been the centres where the students is most unfavoured, generally where they have less preparation, less training for the teachers, less resources, not just because of the circumstances that they have at home, because sadly we have a system where the distribution of resources is not equitable, and that problem has arisen because of that sometimes. And apart from that, that has obliged us to, I think, to rethink the role that for a long time we have thought about as the school as balancing out. When we bring it back home, when we see that the family cannot accompany, there you can clearly see, on the one hand, and I think that is what Geordie was saying, isn't it, the role that the school can have. And also another interesting thing about a crisis like this is that we've stretched the system, and we've seen all the things that fail. Inequality was there before, but we realized it much more, and how school wasn't attending to that properly. For example, how we evaluate and how flexible the curriculums are, and how we can adapt to changing situations. I think on the one hand, the school has been valued more, and it's opened up and generated a debate. And I think it goes beyond the crisis. There's been a debate, interesting debates about the Spanish case for repetition, and that will be maintained afterwards. And one of the subjects that has been mentioned also is the gap of digital skills among teachers, and that has come out more, perhaps even more than many of the other gaps that Alvaro was mentioning during the pandemic. And it is true also, furthermore, that the teachers and education centres have made a great effort, because it has been from one day to the next that you have to change all your skills in very complex situations. Then there you have to congratulate all the teachers who had to reconvert from one day to the next. But also looking at the future, perhaps that is one of the things where we've exposed the most that need also of making progress in that sense. I don't know how you viewed that.
I agree with this gap that Geordie mentioned and Alvaro. I think that I want to, though, talk in favour of something that's not quite so visible. The victim, him or herself, is the other people's themselves, because you can connect up, but you're basing yourself on the idea that the child or pupil has to be autonomous and knows how to be effective and work on their own, and knows what has to go over, what they need to spend more time on, what they have to consult about. So you have to have a training for children and students to be able to do this autonomously within formal education. So at different levels of education, this whole experience is possible, has been possible, but in primary cases, primary children, secondary children, and also in vocational training, they may not have that autonomy because they haven't been prepared for this. The younger generations say that they're digital natives, but perhaps they can use Twitter very happily, but they don't know how to use formal material in internet and source information. So I think really the problem here is that children need to know what they have to ask, how they can be competent, how they can learn. Also, without this presence that they have, there are many other things that we've lost, that we've missed through observing other students or observing the teacher. We see the icon, we might have just an initial without a picture, and sometimes the teacher is there, sometimes not. So the situation often varies greatly. People say, well, I can connect now, perhaps I can't. And so this is a bit of a black hole, as it were. Children and pupils may be saying, well, I don't know, perhaps do I disconnect now? Do I do this exercise? Or perhaps I have to ask a question, or the teacher's going to call me and tell me that I'm not paying attention. But in this online universe, I think people feel quite lost, and this is a handicap. There are also students have learning difficulties because technology as a support, well, there are alternative methods and they help us to communicate, but the thing about this tool is perhaps a step backward in some way, because the students are changing their concept of education, and teachers have taken on a new role, that of being a sort of technology server, or they have to know about operating systems, what's in YouTube, they have to manage all these systems. Perhaps they have to say to the children or students, you're not on the right page, go to the configuration page, you're not in the right address, or you're... so there's, apart from actually teaching the class and being a guide in education or preparing a project, and there's also a technical support facet for teachers. So sometimes you lose a student without, they're suddenly not online, you haven't noticed, but when you're there in the classroom with them, you can see who's there, you can see who's paying attention, and then this multitasking aspect is very difficult. Our cognitive systems are perhaps not prepared for that. So this automation is not there. So very often we have students reacting very differently. Sometimes I'm paying attention to one lot and forgetting another lot of students. So this is a great handicap when it comes to teaching online. And I think we should bear that in mind.
Antes comentábamos.
Before we were mentioning this, and I wanted to mention this to Alejandra, who's there in remote, if you want to intervene and say, if we see you on the screen, just lift your hand and then you can have your say. But we were mentioning, obviously, everything has been stretched, the systems have been stretched, the stitching has been stretched, so everywhere. And when we meet up in October in enlightED, I think that one of the big conversations that we're going to have will probably be what of these mindset changes that have occurred will remain, or are we going to go backwards? Have we realized that in order to properly attend the pupils and students, we have to have a mixture of technology and personal relationship, or have we realized that the teachers have to have those capacities, or have we realized the importance of the gaps? All the things that you've mentioned and that we were mentioning before in our conversation, do you really think that what has happened, that what can we get that is positive in the sense of a change in mindset as an educational community with all the stakeholders in order to make progress and really to face those gaps that have become so obvious? Are you optimistic or pessimistic, and do you think there's a potential, or can this be a point of change which will help us to change a little bit more quickly in other things? I don't know if Alejandra, you would like to start.
Well, okay, that's great. Well, this question is very interesting, and I'm going to...
De los temas que trabajo yo, que son desde el potencial de la política, ¿no? Para direccionar estos cambios. Y ahí me parece...
So, I think there's an enormous learning process that we're not conscious of sometimes, but our meetings with the minister, with the heads of schools, what comes up is that there are different types of collaboration and different ways of setting things up. We had systems that were in place before, but they worked to a lesser extent. So I think in October we have to talk a great deal more about this and how to potentiate this. The first is setting up different sets of policies between the Ministry of Education nationally, and also at provincial level, and also at municipality level in local areas, between the ministries of health, of education, and the ministries that look closely at social protection. And this was done to a great extent. So relationship between the private and public sector, and I think this is vital to be able to move forward with in the digital area. We can't think that we must have clear approach to get over the challenges there. And the third question is the different levels of government. And I think perhaps never before have we had to fine-tune those decisions so carefully. What was done at the level of a province and what was set for a municipality or an individual school. This had to be laid down clearly, opening and closing of schools, etc. This had to be really clearly spelled out. And I think in the work that I've been doing in in organisation, in education centres that analyse policies to make recommendations to G20. So I think this the digital area has tremendous potential, and we need to have a greater collaboration between countries through the G20. So I think the connection between Spain and Latin America is something where we can, because we share our language, this is something where we can, gives us the possibility of sharing a lot of knowledge through on digital areas. So I think sometimes we don't realize how much we have to go back to looking at these questions.
What do you think over here? Well, she was talking about the role particularly of the school, of the educational centre. One of the lessons of this pandemic is the role, we were talking about this before, of independence, autonomy. It's put it in before our nose, the successful or not that we've been with managing the pandemic has been thanks to the flexibility and the role of schools, of the educational communities, and even city councils helping by giving way in order to adapt to that circumstances. And that brings us to thinking, and I think that that has to remain in the midterm. How can we encourage that autonomy? How can we accompany it with resources? Autonomy or independence does not mean, can't mean just leaving everyone to their own affairs, but it is true that we know that in a world where we have to respond to challenges like a pandemic, but also others that will come along, that the flexibility of the educational system will depend on that capacity of being more autonomous, more independent. And this connects up with another thing, and that's innovation within the educational system. We have found there have been teachers and headmasters like Geordie, many schools that have been trying out new solutions. Some have worked worse, others better, but that's innovating, that's testing things out. And the question that the educational system has to ask itself is how, well, we have to learn from investigation, research and innovation, how we can be able of identifying what the things that have worked well in order to scale it up to the rest of the system. How can we best identify what works, and how can we incentivate those who've done it well so that they can share it with others? I think that there's a key element that has to help us think about what can happen in the future. Well, I think that we have to remember that the gaps have not disappeared, neither has the pandemic, but the gaps certainly haven't. And all the system has to work hard in order to see how we can reduce the gaps that exist in our society. And in fact, we have to go look deeper into how we can change the pedagogic models in our schools so that these students, when they join society, they can help to transform and improve society. The teaching component is very relevant. I think that for a very long time we've been talking about what education we want and what for. And this is very closely linked to technology and the use of technology, which we decide to use. But for what? Alvaro doesn't like us to talk about medicine, but for us technology is like for a doctor to do a magnetic resonance. It's a tool that helps us to define and how to intervene with the patient, but it is still the use of the tool will be very determining. And of course, I think that technology should help us to work in a network. We lose a lot of energy and synergy independently by and make great efforts that are very not productive at all. And in big data, in this world, we are still working with in the old style. Now, positive things, we talk about emotional skills, and I think we've had to deal with, without alternative, the flexibility, the adaptation, the capacity of resilience. And I think it is very interesting to stress the adaptation capacity that girls and boys and young people have demonstrated in our society. They've been much more plastic or flexible than the adults. Also from the perspective of learning, for them it's been relevant learning. Perhaps we've learnt less language or less social studies, but we're getting ready for life. We're preparing ourselves for life. We're discussing how to include the emotional skills in the teaching in our schools. They've had to take their own decisions. They've had to become involved. They've had to be more creative than ever. How many campaigns have we seen? Viral campaigns of students, pupils, calling to society and telling society that we can get out of this, that we're able to do it, that, and I think they'll have that in their backpack too. And finally, another thing that you've mentioned, of course we have seen something that we knew, but now I think we put it to the fore much more, and that's social learning, indeed. But not only social, it mustn't only be social. Currently, for the last 10 years, I think more than 100 million people have studied courses for training in universities through open blogs. And I think the most important, interesting thing that we have to stress is the people who wanted to do a MOG is because they wanted to learn, to convey the idea that we don't learn to achieve results, but we learn because of motivation and out of interest, and in also to put our knowledge as a result is a very different proposal. And here technology can diversify our learning. If the social learning implies that we do all the same at the same time, at the same moment, and we assess everybody in the same way, I think it won't fit with the social model of learning that we were talking about. I know you weren't referring to that, but I think that technology has to allow us to personalize learning much more and diversify it much more. Why can't those people choose what they want to, depending on their personality, on their interests and their capacities? And this opens up many possibilities.
Well, talking about social learning, what I mean is you learn because of the consequences that the situation has for third persons. I think you have to learn much more quickly than in normal situation when you're looking at different hypotheses that might come up when you're looking for a particular objective. I think I'm not going to be practicing a different road or a different route that will take longer. I'll use lots of techniques right from the time I start off, but as a young child. But the thing is, this is about resource management. This is how my cognitive process works, and I think that social learning is about learning social skills. We're talking about autonomous learning with adults or young people who have experience in the past. They know what they want, they know what they like and what they're interested in, and what they're good at, what they're bad at, or at least we should work that way. So I think we can say, yes, okay, I can direct my teaching, but in very early ages, children have this habit of going to class. They're used to seeing their friends, and they don't think about, I want to learn, I have my motivations, my interests. They do have these, but this socializing process happens, evolves. It's not something that I can say, a child can say, oh, I'm going to spend 2 hours this week in maths, and I'm going to be doing this. I'm going to talk about this to a particular teacher, and I'm going to plan, and I'm going to know what I'm going to do. That doesn't happen in small children. They need to develop this orientation. So as a teacher, I see that we have to give them tools to be able to understand and say to them, don't worry, I think we can help you to motivate yourself and manage your time, and because by giving you support. I think to be able to follow up the progress of pupils in this kind of system, we have to help them to manage their times with series of different activities. But in secondary education, I think we really have to work on competition, on competitiveness, and even though there's a machine or some equipment or artificial intelligence or a set of tools, whatever, the presence is different. It captures your attention much more. I'm going to have to regulate my attention much more there in that type of setting.
Well, in Save the Children, we haven't experienced this because we work children in poverty. And one of the things that we've done is that face-to-face school cannot be replaced, and I think that is a lesson that unfortunately we've all learned. But because of the link, and when we're talking about inequality, we're talking about children that have more difficulties at home, and generally they have more difficulties feeling part of their school, the link with their tutor, with their groups of school of colleagues. That is vital. But not only for that, but also for them to remain at school. And that is something that we have to think about in the future. So the educational scar that this crisis can leave behind it in terms of what is going to happen with the trajectory of many children at school also binds you.
Yes, this is what you were saying.
Y poder compartir.
Share. And say, okay, I can give you this resource. I'm online. Are you online? I think we've broken a little bit this door, down this door. This idea of having the door shut and I'm here with my pupils in my private room. No, we're in a virtual classroom. It's very different. We feel that there's more collaboration. I think. There's more sharing of materials by the teachers now. You know, and we say, okay, here's the material I have. You can have this. I can share this with other teachers. I think these communication channels and this social learning for teachers is vital. And this came from before, of course. We had this before, but we need to continue encouraging this, that the school of the future underlines that we're all in the same boat. This fear of being evaluated and of highlighting our shortcomings, we don't need to worry about.
Well, you can have more ability to share in the web. And it's interesting because this hybrid world which we're going towards has these paradoxes. On the one hand, it's what you said that we've discovered. On the one hand, the value of classroom work, of face-to-face, personal relations also, and also we've seen the potential of technology. And here, now, to get into the second section of our debate, before we go on to the third, I want to concentrate a little bit on the technology aspects. And particularly, I would like us to talk about the things that you have seen that technology has improved in this pandemic. Marisa was mentioning some. And something that interests me a lot, and that's the relationship between the socio-economic gap and the digital gap. Obviously, the socio-economic gap is something that was there. It's something that conditions a lot of things, and very often it prevents you, perhaps, from joining the digital world. But I would like to know your opinions about how, let's say, technology can also help us in the other way. In other words, to try to close that socio-economic gap, if that is possible. It's true that technology has that power of being attractive and interactivity, which very often allows us to generate that interest among students and teachers. It's a bit of a complex question, but I don't know what you think. Well, I would answer. I'm from Murcia, but I go backwards and forward like a Galician. But I would answer that question with another question, and I would like to refer to what Geordie said. Technology is useful depending on what we want it for. And I'll take the example of COVID. The time that we've taken to generate a vaccine shows that when we put an effort into it and the resources, innovation sometimes allows us to get over a goal. So the question is technology going to help us to close the gaps? Well, do we want, we're going to concentrate the goal so that technology can serve to close the gap? Because up until now, we've been talking about we don't have the best teachers or the best management or headmasters. This can continue to happen. Technology can happen. This educational innovation still happens in the schools where the pupils who most need it are not there. Why don't we take that innovation and use the best tools, the most innovative projects with technology? We take it to the schools where the most disfavored pupils and who most need to improve their educational system. But are we aware, in other words, what is the challenge that we want? This is another phrase from Seneca. There's no good wind for a sailor who doesn't know where he's going, and that happens with technology. What is the goal and the means? Because the challenges, we knew them before in a country like ours, where children, the most vulnerable children, have 5 more times probabilities of having to repeat the courses or of dropping out. As an NGO globally, there are 180 million children who are not in schooling before the crisis. Now, let's say it'll be 10 million more because of poverty, or even 20 million more. These are the challenges. So you can do things when we want to. Yes, I can give you a couple of examples. Internationally, for example, we have a project also with Fundación Telefónica, with Profutura. We're working in order to use digital tools in Liberia, in Tanzania, also with refugee camps also. And these are contexts when we were talking about those millions who are left out, they're mostly out of education. And that is the question. For example, there's another case in Jordan where we developed an application that has allowed us for these pupils which also are behind can catch up working with the application with their mathematics skills, and it helps the teacher to balance things out. So we have opportunities. Yes, for example, why don't we use technology in order to make schools less bureaucratic? We always think about technology and then we think about devices and digital blackboards, but why don't we digitalize in order to have less bureaucracy, so that the teams can lead, so that teachers can teach instead of doing paperwork? I was talking about big data, the possibilities that offers us to exploit the data in order to prevent dropout rates. Now with big data, with learning analytics, that's the subject, that's the term that's being used. We can identify much more who are the profiles that are most at risk of dropout in order to deal with them better. And all the feedback now, it's much easier. There are applications that allow us to know better the situation of the students in the classroom, to get feedback also from the pupils in the classroom. There are a whole load of things that we can do this can allow us to do it. But if that is the goal, and obviously in Chile we want to do that. We can't see Alejandra, so let's not forget her, although she's there in remote.
This is a great question that we're dealing with, that we're trying to answer the challenges now and in the future. I'm thinking about the potential that technology has had in different times. There's a first one that we can see in regions which are still affected by the pandemic. It's giving possibility to schools that have had to move into the virtual space, where on-site classes were absolutely impossible. As all of speakers have said, we have discovered, in fact, that on-site teaching is not replaceable, even with all the magic of technology. There is no doubt about this. And there's also no doubt that technology, well used, with excellent educational skill, can improve teaching and learning, and also the systems of information to be able to take decisions more effectively, to be able to close this gap. But in the short term, I think that technology is giving us that possibility. But at the same time, we're learning how to multiply space over time, and how we learn and how quickly we learn, and aggregating time for learning. So if I think we should document these changes and what we're learning. This is a great opportunity for our countries and regions and schools where perhaps the school day is very limited in comparison with other areas. Latin America has much shorter school days than other regions in the world, but we perhaps extend our learning hours by using that technology. So there's two major potentialities there. But we have to work on decisions in this, through the principle of justice, to be able to really get over these gaps that we've been talking about, social, education, etc., and also individual gaps. With these tools that the students can use that are and students, their ability to use these tools is very different. So also from the teacher's point of view, without the skillful view and approach of the teacher, we can't do much. So this is fundamental. We need to potentiate this.
No.
I think a reference has been made to you. Well, Alejandro said that very well. I agree fully. If I have a resonance, I don't know what to do with it. And technology on its own will not give an answer. We have to redefine the situation. That's the big debate. Here there's a nuance, and we have to split what is virtual and being in the classroom, and on the other hand, what is the role of technology? At what age is it useful, and what uses is it best for? In many countries, it doesn't seem to give better teaching, but in other students, particularly when it is linked to the individualization of the learning, it is shown that the learning is better. We'll come back to the same thing. We have to define what is the use we're going to make of it and what is the teaching use of it. And then there's a much more complex point which goes beyond education. That's the role of technology in our lives and the educational role and non-educational role. To start with, after the experience of the pandemic, we have many figures that show that the young people, there are a bit more attempts of suicide, more self-harm, more depression, more difficulties of positive self-image experiences, and the pandemic and the non-social life has worsened that. But the pandemic has also conditioned many families to provide our children with technological tools at a very early age in order to be able to link up with the learning. But they become daily tools in their personal lives also. So we have a huge number of children, very early age, that are accessing TikTok and Instagram and other social networks below the recommended age, and that are have an image of maths at a much higher level. And I think here that we have to think about this as a society. How do we make use of that so that it is safe and educational, so that the technology is efficient in the evolution and in our children and young people? And that's not a minor matter, because if we separate one from the other, we're not going to be able to manage to achieve what we want. I think this is a little bit outside the educational subject, but the mobile is in our pockets. It is useful for learning, but it's also used for many other things. What is the role of parents, educators, in order to make a rational and efficient use of it in our lives? And what models are we as educators, not just teachers, but also families and our groups of friends and our family and friends dinners, meetings? Also, that is all education too. Quite agree. I would like to be brief commentary now, in case anyone in the audience that is here face to face, or somebody on the streaming has a comment that they would like to make. If you're here, you can raise your hand, and if it is remotely, well, my colleague will give it to me. Now, Geordie, to go on to the last section of our debate, we've talked about what the pandemic has taught us and how the way we teach has changed, but you have brought in a subject, and that is what we should teach and what we should learn for the present and for the future, because you mentioned this is the present now. It has affected us fully. We are surrounded by social networks. We're more aware of the likes that we get for our latest photograph. That we're more following that more than the person that we're with, and that's important to know and to think about what we have to learn. But there's also a vision of the future. Well, we've just faced a pandemic a world pandemic that has affected us throughout our lives. It has been shown that technology that was accelerating exponentially will accelerate even more, and this will change all aspects of our lives. And we're talking a lot about the fact that young people will be working in employments that don't yet exist, but also there's a planet that has huge problems, environmental, health problems, work problems, labour problems. I don't know how you view this shake-up that the pandemic has given us. Is it also an opportunity in order to bring in the educational system in this common knowledge of what we want to teach? What are these new challenges? And whoever wants to take the floor on that, Alejandra, perhaps, who's on the other side of the Atlantic, or Álvaro. Well, linking up with what Geordie said, I think it is very important how we define digital skills. Clearly, this is the new literacy, and digital skills it's absolutely necessary to include it in our educational goals. But how do we find that? In Chile, we all insist of a safe use, ethical and critical use of technology, and that is very important. And we're talking about digital citizenship. So if we have relations through technology, we need to have ethical criteria, and we need to know how to use it safely. Geordie was talking quite rightly about the children in social networks and the internet. This has regulatory implications also that we could talk about. Have we got all the mechanisms that the internet can be safe nowadays for boys and girls, for them to use the new technologies? But also there's a teaching aspect that we have to teach how to use it and how to protect yourself from the web, and how to protect your data. Then there's a lot of technology, the sexual abuse, violence, and we have to remember all of these things when we give children and teenagers the skills, or to be able to differentiate what is correct information, what is not, what are the messages that are not really true to reality. And that is one thought. And the other one is, well, we're in a process of strategic planning in our organisation. We've consulted the children in our participation groups, and with regards to digitalisation, one of the main things that came out was, well, many things came out, but among them, we want to be listened to with regards to what we want to learn. And what did they say? We don't want to just learn by heart. We want more creativity, more critical thinking. They also said that we want the educational system should listen to us more, the stress that we have. That's what the people said. And to manage our emotions, I think this well reflects the type of subjects on the one hand, those skills that for example, for the time being, and it all indicates that you cannot automate through machines. In other words, empathy, collaboration, cooperation, critical thought, creativity. These are skills which, apart from, well, particularly the socio-emotional is another category, because of the that has a very important role, the management of your own emotions and also social relations. This is a subject that is becoming more important, well-being. These are things that we have to also include in these curriculums in the pandemic. And another subject that's very interesting is, what is the challenge? There's nothing more global that makes us more aware that we're connected with what is happening in China than a pandemic. And also we have to think about to what extent our curriculums are incorporating the global climate change. And I'm very careful about that. I have to be. We can't ask schools to do everything, I understand that, but we have to think, at least if we can give the tools so that this critical thought, that girls and boys can have that, so that this critical way of thinking can come into their lives and into schools.
I think also the families are very important. It's not just the school with bearing all the responsibility. We've been doing a lot of talks for the parents, and the main concern about technology was also how children were using internet, and there's a huge unknown factor there. Parents say, well, I know that my son our daughter knows how to use internet, but there's often a lot of lack of knowledge on the part of the parents and what the kids are using the mobile for, because we think about being able to look at our email and being locatable, but our child, our offspring, may well be thinking about some very different. So we need to inculcate this, what the mobile is for. So often young people are not really conscious of the challenges and the selfie, and that's become a sort of obsession with so many young people, and the question of how children are affected in what they eat and what they drink and what they see in internet. There are huge numbers of damage and harm done to young people because they're tremendously affected by what they see on that screen. So we have to use technology, yes, but we need to educate young people to use that technology effectively. And this information that we get that we put into the internet, where does it go? And we very often don't look at the conditions of the contracts when we look at access to photographs, information, etc. Where's the limit? What are these social media, etc., going to do with that information? So if we look at education, I think we have to be very cautious there and alert to what may be done to that information, because we've got academic results there, we might have disciplinary action, exam results, assessment on different children, or also teachers. Once this information is in internet, it's not really yours anymore. It's not your private information. So I think technology needs to accompany us, but we must be careful because it's possibility of communicating in this situation of lack of communication. But we need to make a big effort. As we're not ready and not prepared, we need to gradually acquire the skills that we need to be able to use that technology more effectively. It needs to be at our service. We should not be at the service of technology or social media, whatever. I have to innovate because the system's telling me to innovate. No. What do I really want to achieve in the short, medium and long term? What benefits will I obtain from this? So I think that technology makes a lot of things easier. There are many aspects in which technology helps us, but sometimes it becomes a handicap. We're thinking of mental health, of the overuse of tablets, of mobiles, and children online 6 hours when they could be there for 20 minutes, or connecting too much to Instagram or video games, etc., or the Tweets channel, which competes with YouTube. What would I like to be? They're thinking about professions. Perhaps a child of 10 is might even have their own channel where they want to project their own future, etc. And then there's Fortnite, and everybody's contacting, but we're not conscious really of what is beyond this. We have to be careful that technology is great and is very beneficial for us in many ways, but it mustn't be driving us. We need to be driving it. We need to be into control of this and achieving benefits.
Y luego Geordie, sobre este mismo tema de...
So we're going to go to Alejandra and then Geordie.
¿De qué hay que aprender?
Yes, we have to look at what we have to learn. I think the question of what and trying to take this to relations between different countries and how policies can help us in education and this acceleration we see of inequalities. I think on that question, the pandemic has shown us the connection, the interconnection of the world and how we depend on each other. We depend on this connection. So also, sometimes the frontiers were closed down, and we have to really continue potentiating this collaboration, this openness in this world, which must be more prosperous and more fair. So I think to get over these gaps that we've been talking about in this meeting, we know that at individual level this gap accumulates in areas where children live in regions of conflict and also suffer exclusion for many other reasons, and they may be excluded for ethnic reasons or gender reasons, etc. So we have to really highlight the situation of countries and individuals to be able to accompany them through these policies and be very pragmatic. Looking at educational budgets, we see that there's a drop in educational budgets, not at country level just, but aid from different countries. We've had some very major donor countries to be able to achieve a fairer world. And what we're seeing is that there's less and less of this now. There are fewer and fewer funds to be able to set up these programs. So I think really if we want to prioritize education, we have to really do this exercise of collaboration and continue to attend to the major problems in education which have major effects for the future, and really emphasize the importance of these budgets.
Well, linking up with what Alejandra said, this community vision of education is essential. It goes beyond the school. There are synergies involving politicians, the media, social partners, and the school, of course, itself. And this is what the future depends on. And the next stop after the pandemic is the pandemic of sustainability. And this doesn't have a vaccine. So if we don't work now as educators, if we're not able to identify and get get involved to transform it, we won't be able to have the tools to resolve the challenges that society will be affected by very soon. In a world where there is so much technology and the more automated process, the greatest value, what has the greatest value is to be more human than ever. And the what of education has to be the balance between encouraging knowledge, learning, but also to improve personal skills which make us unique in critical thinking, and be able to have empathy, capacity to adapt. The pandemic, therefore, has tested us as a community. How often have we seen on television behavior that irritates us from a social point of view? If we want to have a better society, we have to learn to have community behavior that is better than collective, and that has to be learnt, and that has to be done from many different contexts. But yes, one more thing here. Without motivation, there's no learning. You can't learn without motivation. You don't stop TikTok to know what is happening in the world, and we have to promote. Sometimes we're very critical with the young people, and as we get older, we see things in a much more pessimistic way. But I think we have to generate the greatest motivation in order to be able to understand that society is part of our lifestyle, and we're part of it, and that education is part of that transformation of society. Okay, well, we're running out of time, actually. I don't know if there are any questions from the audience. There we have one. You're going to get a microphone passed to you.
Yes,
I wanted to thank you for this panel. It's been really interesting. I think it's a debate that affects us all and interests us all. I'm not a mother, but I am an aunt, and my sister is a teacher, so she has two daughters, 2 and 3 years of age. So I've really been conscious of her suffering and of how she suffered when she was teaching. And one day, my sister sat down at one of those tables that you might have at home if you've got children. She had her child had no other place to sit. So what happened was her older child came in while my sister was actually teaching a class of 12, and the 3-year-old said, "Oh, mummy's stolen my table," and so this is very tricky. So what we always talk about children and young people not knowing how to handle technology, but really they were born with those technologies, and very often they don't know exactly how to use these, but they need to be trained and taught. But what about recommendations for parents? How do I manage to be able to work well with my children and with social networks and to do things right? We need to know what they're doing with their phones. Parents, aunties, uncles, etc. I think we need a few tips to see what the best way, so we know what the best way of using this technology is. Alejandra? Yes, as a recommendation, I think we have to use common sense. Technology is just another tool to regulate the behavior of our children and teach them how to use this information. We teach them, for example, not to talk to strangers, or where they have to do specific tasks and what they have to do if they're worried about something or they have to phone, or if they, for example, what they eat or what they shouldn't eat, etc. And they shouldn't eat too much of what they really like, and perhaps patterns for effective sleep, healthy habits. So this is just another element like that. We perhaps don't have to emphasize a particular application or some kind of parental pin or something to be able to teach me as a parent to as regards what I have to do, how to handle this. I think we have to educate these children and young people so that they can be responsible and so they understand the consequences are of incorrect behavior. So it's educating, it's training, just as in any other area of life. We shouldn't demonize the mobile, and because it does advance education, but children need to know what advantages there are, what dangers there are also. For example, if you suddenly get your driving license and you can drive a car, but you have to think very carefully about how this is done. And so also making comments about people on social media, which is a crime, negative comments. So all this information that our children share, they needs to be done in a responsible way, and because this also affects children's sleep. Children who take their phones to bed and they're connected under the blankets, whatever, and they're connected on the telephone till all hours. So we have to regulate their behavior with this technology. So we have to set down effective patterns. I think we mustn't demonize this, though. I mean, this is just another aspect.
That's very interesting, because parental control is the parents. Yes, that's the idea. I like the example of the car, but I don't agree, really. Nobody gives the keys of the car to their child before age 18. But all teenagers before age 16, which is the recommended age by the European Union, have WhatsApp. So we're not so thorough or strict with fulfilling laws, complying with laws in real life as with technological contexts. And our generation has been overwhelmed by technology, and we have indiscriminate use. It's very difficult for a father or mother 10 years with a mobile on the table, looking at it repeatedly when you're eating, and when a child gets to be a teenager, if you do that, you can't tell them not to do that. We copy. So we have to give a good example in the use of technology. We often make it becomes the child's parking space because we're too busy sometimes and we don't manage our work or our stress. And I think, therefore, there are very simple solutions that seem logical, but something is escaping us because they're not the most popular or common. But to have public spaces for use of technology, to pact or to agree to times of use, and we have a very tough policy in order to try to find coincidence with consensus with many families, so that the mobile gets there as late as possible. And we're working. I'm talking about intelligent mobile. In my generation, let's say, since we were very small, we didn't suffer, our parents didn't suffer like we suffer. But I understand in the current society we suffer a lot if the children go alone, go outside alone. This is assault. You can send an SMS, but intelligent mobiles are an open door to everything without control. So, and in a pocket. So the later it comes, the more maturity there is in a teenager and more ready that teenager is in order to manage the device better. But I think you would have to organize another debate, or you've done that already, in order to involve families in order to make our family models more uniform. One of the biggest problems that we have currently is the great variety of educational models, which makes it difficult to have a consensus among families. Well, thank you very much. We've run out of time, and as you know, after this talk, we have a working group with more than 70 experts who will continue to develop these really big questions. And I would like to thank you all very much indeed for your contributions, Geordie, Alvaro, Marisa, Alejandra from Argentina. It's really been fascinating. We've made progress with many subjects, and I think we've shown that in October the conversation will be very important. And for all of you here, and those of you who are following us through internet, I want to tell you and reiterate that commitment this year is to build enlightened together, to follow, encourage you to follow us in the enlightened network and the three partners, Fundación Telefónica and University of South Summit, for you to accompany us, because we will upload all these ideas in order to enable you to participate and to get to October with these big debates and big questions. And having made progress, and I want to encourage all the educational community, because there's something new this year. We're going to award with enlightened and support the innovative and educational projects that arise around the world. So I would like to finish also by encouraging all of you, or those of you who have projects in schools, in higher education, in startups and companies. You can all see that in the enlightened network. So to register and present your projects in order to participate in this competition, and we will be delighted to try to support those that are most relevant and to put our little grain of sand in order to get innovation to make progress. And thank you very much. In the next meeting, not yet in October, because we have two more on the 1st of July and on the 8th, and then in October. Well, thank you very much.
Switch on.